All right, guys. So let's get it going here in our Civil War notes. Uh, you had to have guessed I'm a damn Yankee. You know I was going to be a William Tecumseh Sherman fan. Let's get going, guys. This lecture is essentially going to wrap up our unit on the Civil War. We'll kind of transition into the Compromise of 1877. We'll talk about Reconstruction itself and then the Compromise of 1877 when we get back from school. Uh, but you're working on this video over the break, and I hope it won't take you too long. We're going to repeat some of the notes where we were, quickly. That the election of 1860, putting Abraham Lincoln into office, had made it clear to the South that uh, this slavery issue would come to a head, and they turned it into a self fulfilling prophecy. They immediately secede from the Union, they being notably South Carolina, right? Who had stood up once before on this question of secession as it related to the nullification crisis. So South Carolina kind of had a history of being the largest, most significant states' rights state, as it were, and anti union, as it were. So they are the first to secede December 20 of 1860, before Lincoln is even in office. In fact, before he takes office, six other states had seceded, right? In order, they go South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee. The CSA, the Confederate States of America, elect Jefferson Davis as their president. They eventually will move their capital from Montgomery, Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. But it is on like Donkey Kong, and the bullets fly when we get to Fort Sumter, where the South essentially asks the Union to surrender the fort. President Buchanan at first, and then Lincoln refuse. Lincoln decides he's going to go ahead and resupply the fort with Union supplies. He's just going to uh, act like this is not happening. And the South decides to attack. And after a 2 day bombardment, the fort is eventually surrendered to the South, and the Civil War is off and running. Um, it really gets heated when Lincoln calls for and receives 75,000 volunteers. Um, and so now it's clear that like there's no turning back. And in fact, a series of other states, including North Carolina, all joined secession, refusing to fight essentially against their Southern brothers. And so we're going to see this war play out, and each side is going to have some distinct advantages or disadvantages. The South, of course, is kind of fighting on their home turf. They're committed to the war. They have excellent military leadership. They have perhaps some advantages of being more guerrilla like in their nature. But ultimately, the war is going to be won by the machine, right? And the machine is up north, where, as we've been talking about, industry had taken a much earlier grip going back to the first colonies and expanding through the expansion of railroads and the Industrial Revolution. And so they have the larger population base, they have the greater manufacturing base, they have the greater transportation system, and all of these inherent advantages. And plus, they are, after all, the Union. They are the nation, not the secessionists. Um, so, in the early stages of war, it's actually pretty interesting um, because we talked about the call for volunteers, and that works for a little while, but eventually drafts take place. In the North, mind you, you can pay somebody to take your spot. It ain't me. It ain't me. I ain't fortunate son. And in the South, if you're a large slaveholder, you're exempt. I might actually recommend two films for you. We're going to talk about this film project. Now, I mentioned Gangs of New York here, but talking about exempt slaveholders, I would probably also point out the film Free State of Jones, starring Matthew McConaughey. Um, and Gangs of New York shows the draft riots. Maybe some parental discretion on that one. But here we have increasing mobilization of volunteers and then drafted troops, and the armies are getting larger, and the war is escalating. Both sides thought at first it would be a very short war. And in fact, the first battle, the first shots, of course, are fired in Antietam. But the first battle is the Battle of Bull Run, July of 1861, just outside of Washington, D.C. And the people living in the area gather on the hillside with picnic lunches to watch the battle like it's an afternoon matinee. They thought, in fact, it was going to be such a quick war that it would be like a one and done kind of thing. But in fact, just like they were at Antietam, the South is victorious at Bull Run. And the Union forces have to retreat back to Washington. On their retreat, they're slowed by the rush hour traffic from the people who went to go watch the battle. Um, Crazy, crazy stuff here in the first battle, and the result shows the nation that this thing could go longer than we had predicted. Union commanders, perhaps early on, were reluctant to really employ their full force. They are, after all, shooting upon Americans. Robert E. Lee, who's the commander of the Southern forces, was West Point classmates with most of the generals that he's now in battle against. And so there's certainly some early reluctance by the Union. The Union's primary strategy to win this battle, to win this war, excuse me, is what we will call the Anaconda Plan. Okay. And that is to essentially strangle, like an anaconda would, the Confederacy. They want to cut off uh, the South by east west by controlling the Mississippi River. So they're going to cut off Texas, of course, right? They are going to blockade all of the southern ports, Savannah, Wilmington, preventing the trade of cotton, all right, because wars cost money. So they want to economically strangle the South. It's interesting, actually, for those of you who might go out to Wrightsville for the beach. You might know the resort, the Blockade Runner. Well, that's got its etymology in a Civil War term. So if you imagine the blockade in the Atlantic Ocean would be a series of ships serving to deter these export ships of cotton sailing out to England, and they could do so effectively unless the cotton was moved by smaller, the equivalent, if you will, of like speedboats, like drug runners would use speedboats today. Those speedboats would be blockade runners. They would be small, fast, quick, and nimble enough to make it through the blockade. Again, the Union has major naval advantages, like these ships that they can station out in the Atlantic. Um, they capture the city of New Orleans. We remember how important that was going back to the War of 1812, right? It was at the time, uh, until replaced by New York, the largest and most important financial center in all of the nation. It remains so for the South in the early stages here of the Civil War. Um, the Battle of Antietam is set off in September of 1862, the bloodiest single day in American history. 26,000 casualties, dead or injured, on a single day in American history, more than the entire Mexican American War and that War of 1812 combined. So deadly, it convinces Europe we're going to stay out of this thing. So Europe is on the sidelines watching what happens here in America. Politically, the nation is as divided as it was headed into the war, right? We know that it was this buildup to the war that cut the Democratic Party in half. They remain cut in half. There are divided loyalties both in the North as well as in the South. Probably again more so in the North. There are a group of Northern Democrats who kind of essentially allow for secession. They're called Copperheads. Like you got to watch out for that snake that would bite you. Um, and the parties are fractured, the people are fractured, the nation is fractured. Um, Lincoln, as president now, has to deal with issues involving slave states that had stayed in the Union. Remember now, not all slave states seceded. Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, all were slave states, but they stayed in the Union. What does he do? Okay. Um, Notably, Lincoln actually acts like Andrew Jackson. He kind of ignores the Constitution at a couple different points here during the Civil War. One is he suspends the writ of habeas corpus. Now, you think about the etymology of that word, corpus, like corpse. Habeas corpus means essentially in Latin to present the body, right? So we have a constitutional right when we are arrested to understand what we're being arrested for, what the charges are, to go in front of a judge and to understand, what the process will be. Lincoln suspends that. If he thinks that there are traitors within the Union from these slave states that would conspire to have more states secede, I would have to imagine Kentucky and Missouri would be this close to doing so. He's actually essentially locking up those traitors and throwing away the key. He seizes telegraph offices. He limits the communication from these states. So he played some pretty tricky, tough politics with the slave states that had remained in the Union. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, says that no, you can't do that. You've exceeded your powers. And like Lincoln or like Jackson, Lincoln just flat out ignores that ruling. He doesn't get vilified for it like Jackson does, because I think we look at this as kind of extreme times call for extreme measures. We are, after all, at war here, a civil war. Um, in terms of that foreign intervention, again, Europe had kind of watched and decided to stay on the sidelines. Um, the South is hoping for it, right? There's but some incidents kind of conspire against that taking place. One is the Trent affair, when the North, the Union, seizes a British ship and arrests two Confederate diplomats heading to Britain and France. Britain is enraged that they think that, of course, they are acting like a sovereign nation, um, and but they back down once Lincoln releases those diplomats. But you can understand, right, his motivation in trying to prevent that kind of communication, just like with those telegraph offices from the slave Union states to the Confederacy to prevent more secession. Here, his goal is to prevent foreign intervention coming in to favor the Confederated States of America. In wake of the successful blockades, for the most part, King Cotton, as it were, is proving less and less important. And Britain, in fact, begins relying upon northern corn and northern grain and solidifying greater those economic ties between the Union and Great Britain. At first, it's very notable, right, that Lincoln doesn't see this as a war to free the slaves until he sees that he can do so um, with kind of that he can make it a political asset. Okay, even the Emancipation Proclamation itself technically freed no slaves. It wasn't law. It was like a declaration. It was a speech. Lincoln, in order to free the slaves, feels like he really needs to establish some success on the military front. Okay. And he wants to time it, as I said, to make it a political asset, to make it so that it becomes like a tipping point after they've enjoyed some military successes. All right. So here we are looking at the map, right? And you're going to see that it very much kind of mirrors the electoral map of 1860. Um, but now we have a union absent of the Confederate States. So the political implications of secession for the Union are that now there's no opposition to Union ideology. That is to say, that the Union, as it were, can pass any politics, measures, laws that they see fit. Um, they are, there's uh, just Republicans left in office. All of the Democrats essentially had seceded, or if there were Democrats up north, had become fractured or gone on to kind of third party stuff. So here we are with the North kind of running roughshod politically, and the war is embroiling the entire nation. Eventually, the slave system comes under continually increased pressure from Union forces in the South. Um, and Smaller number of whites on plantations, general sabotage from slaves weakens the institution of slavery in the South. Meanwhile, in the North, some free blacks are eventually allowed to serve in the Union armies. Now they've got a tough time. It's not like total equality here. Okay. But there certainly is, I think, an emotional attachment at this point to fighting for their cause of freedom as they begin to see it, as the Civil War will, as we said earlier, become increasingly about freedom. It's notable that there are, in fact, African Americans fighting for the Confederated States as well, but there's greater numbers and there's greater emotional attachment, I think, and a greater story to be told about the Union African American troops. Here, as we get to this project later, I would probably recommend to you the film Glory, 1984 film, I believe, starring Matthew Broderick, Denzel Washington, a young Denzel Washington, and telling the story of the 54th Colored Regiment from Massachusetts fighting for freedom. Uh, Life as a soldier is rough, shall we say? Okay. The medical care out in the field is barbaric, archaic. Um, I would recommend another film here where one of the opening scenes sets up the rest of the film. It's called Dances with Wolves, and it stars Kevin Costner, and then later really gets into westward expansion um, during and beyond the Civil War and relations with Native Americans. But a terrific film, and perhaps could. Oh, by the way, probably the most beautiful cinematography that you'll ever see in any film ever. Okay. Um, but all in all, life as a soldier is difficult. The medical care, life in camps, life as a soldier. There's the death, the disease, the condition of the camps, the condition of the prisons. I might recommend here the film Andersonville is beyond awful. Okay, and I think a number of um, Civil War films, you really get to see just how brutal this war really is. There are a series of major battles that I think we probably want to understand. I already mentioned Antietam, the single deadliest day in American history. Chancellorsville, which was a Southern victory. But Stonewall Jackson actually receives great Southern general, receives friendly fire, as it were, and dies 8 days later. So it's long term really costly for the South there, especially then one of their biggest strengths, of course, is their military leadership. The Battle of Gettysburg, of course, is one that we all know. Absolutely a turning point of the war, a 3 day battle which went back and forth. Ultimately, on the final day, the Union is victorious. Um, they were this close to losing that, and that being a Southern victory, though. And in a dystopian retelling of history, who knows what would have happened if the Battle of Gettysburg had gone another direction. The South, as it were, never would recover from the Battle of Gettysburg. Here, I might plug the film Gettysburg for you guys to check out as we talk about this project. Okay. And then the Battle of Vicksburg is often overshadowed by the Battle of Gettysburg because it's at the same time, July of 1863. Um, but Vicksburg is the last major southern city on the Mississippi River to hold for the South. It's under continual siege for months and will eventually fall to the North and will allow the North to fully execute that Anaconda plan that we talked about earlier, where by capturing Vicksburg finally, they're really able to sever the Confederacy into two using the Mississippi River to cut off the western southern states. Okay. They've captured New Orleans and they've got blockades on the East Coast, and eventually they will go on and, as I said, strangle the South into a Union victory. There are a couple major moments in addition to those major battles that I think it's important that we understand. I had mentioned earlier the Emancipation Proclamation. Um, when Lincoln sees the political strength in declaring for emancipation, and as an exclamation point to a couple much needed military victories in order to get there, that's when he gets into declaring emancipation. Um, and it really does kind of turn the tide of the war in terms of changing the narrative, changing the momentum. I've got a link here for you on this slide. You can learn more about the Emancipation Proclamation. I'd like you to check that out. Then we've got the Gettysburg Address, which is, of course, Lincoln's one of the all-time most famous ever speeches in American history. Um, and I've got a link up here to a short, dramatic recapturing of a major portion of that speech. And these two moments together, as I said, really shift the tide in terms of what we're expecting this war to be about and what we're expecting this war to signify for the nation. So check out the Emancipation Proclamation here and the Gettysburg Address here. Uh, Two major moments in the Civil War. So there are a number of things that you should know when we talk about the Civil War, right? Some of the concepts that we've talked about. Well, I just mentioned, right, the Gettysburg Address, the Emancipation Proclamation. You should understand the Anaconda Plan. In your textbooks are the Monitor, the Merrimack. We're talking about naval ships there. Conscription is simply the draft. I talked about habeas corpus. We talked about the copperheads that would have allowed for easy secession. Okay. Appomattox, we'll get to in just a second. All right. Some of the major figures you should know: Stonewall Jackson, great Southern leader, along with Robert E. Lee, that you need to know. We've talked before about famous abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Clara Barton, famous, of course, as a nurse and a spy, and William Tecumseh Sherman, we'll talk about in a second here. And of course, some of the famous battles, right? We talked about Sumter, Bull Run, Antietam. I mentioned Andersonville, the battles of Gettysburg, Chancellorsburg, Vicksburg, and know more than it was a battle. Know why these battles are so significant. Okay, if you're going to know your Civil War, here's a quick recapture of some of the things that I think you need to know in terms of economics, okay, because all wars kind of come down to dollars, right? Like, what's the number one answer to every question ever asked? Money. The South suffered severe food shortages, inflation, and economic collapse. The Confederated dollar is worth nothing. The Anaconda Plan was a great success. Meanwhile, that industrial economy that we talked about up north boomed because of the war. Whether we like it or not, wars are usually a boost for a nation's economy. In this case, they're a major boost for the already booming northern economy. The northern economy only grows, only becomes more significant in terms of its manufacturing prowess. Their demand for military supplies keeps the industries going. Um, there's some minor flaws with wages, with inflation, but the North absolutely fares much better than the South. Remember when we talk about why the North won the war? Well, we can point to some of these really crucial battles, but I think it's always going to come down to the nature of the economic strength and the advantages that the North had over the South. With the South so hurt by the battles and the success of the Anaconda Plan, um, they're eventually going to surrender in Appomattox, Virginia. Um, Now, one of the final exclamation points on ensuring a Southern surrender is William Tecumseh Sherman's scorched earth march to the sea. Here, uh, Sherman marches Union troops from Savannah, Georgia, or to sorry, from Atlanta to Savannah, and then back up into South Carolina, Columbia, and destroys literally everything in his wake. It's 60,000 Union soldiers um, marching 285 miles first from Atlanta to Savannah. And the goal is essentially to frighten the domestic population, the civilians, into abandoning the Confederated cause, that they see that the Union strength is just too much. So, as this war is being won with military victories, the success of the Anaconda Plan, the last dagger is to show this brute strength to the people. Okay, um, and he doesn't, destroy, like burn to the ground uh, towns in his wake, but they steal food, they steal livestock, they do burn houses and barns of people who try to fight back. Um, and Sherman tells Lincoln that we're not only fighting hostile armies, but we're fighting hostile people, and we need to make everyone, old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war. This is like the final knockout blow that Sherman feels like, and Lincoln goes along with, feels like is necessary to convince the South to give up the lost cause of the Confederacy. And with all that together, we do see the surrender of Robert E. Lee at the Appomattox Courthouse in April 9, 1865. And the war is over. But, footnote, not everyone in North Carolina knows that. In fact, there are a couple battles fought after Lee's surrender. A couple in Texas and a couple right here in North Carolina, including, if anyone knows, you may have done field trips or something when you were younger, up to Bennett Place up in northern Durham. So, but effectively, the war, of course, ends with the Appomattox Courthouse surrender. 75,000 Americans between Confederates and Union forces and civilians, for that matter, are dead. Another 50,000 are wounded. In modern dollars, it costs $3.5 billion in terms of waging the war and the costs of destruction. From the birth of the nation in 1776 up until that first bullet was fired at Fort Sumter, that $3.5 billion represents 2 times all of the federal spending between 1776 and 1861. The slaves are eventually freed, but not by that Emancipation Proclamation, by the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. We'll talk about that when we get back to class. We'll talk about the Civil War amendments. We'll talk about Reconstruction of the South. And then we're going to talk about the Compromise of 1877, the single worst political decision in America history, which ends effectively Reconstruction, ushers in this Jim Crow era, ushers in incidents like we talked about in class the other day with the Wilmington insurrection of 1898. So to close class, I wanted to throw in this video here, a little bit about this project, for you to watch a Civil War film or a Civil War documentary, like Ken Burns' The Civil War. Now, that's multiple parts. It's really good. Ken Burns is amazing. You got to see his Vietnam series, is absolutely off the hook. But the assignment is on Google Classroom, APUSH Civil War movies and film reviews. We talked a little bit about it in class on Thursday or Friday, depending upon when I had you. And this is where I'm going to give you an opportunity, hopefully, to be a little bit creative when you make this project. You can write a paper if you want. I've given you a Screencastify submission, or you can make a TikTok, and give me a film review. But you got to follow the specifications that are laid out for you on Google Classroom. I've given you a series of films or documentaries to choose from. I've given you some uh, points you need to hit on how to do a film review. I've given you some additional questions. You see those on your screen here. So you've got to cover all of that stuff. And can you do it in a TikTok? I would love to see it at me. I hope you're having a great break. I look forward to seeing